Redemption. To atone for one's sins and to be absolved of wrongdoing. It's not the dictionary definition, but it's the definition I'm going with. Redemption is one of the primary storytelling tools in fiction because it's an easy means of creating simple drama. The protagonist does something bad and now for whatever reason needs to redeem themselves for what they did, whether it be personal redemption or external redemption. And very few people in fiction capture that desire for redemption quite like Kratos. His entire fictional life has been one ongoing, seemingly never-ending quest for redemption for the things he's done. When he isn't attempting redemption, he's doing the things that will require him to be redeemed in the next redemption quest. In a well-written story, absolving yourself of sins should be a natural extension of the overall story arc. But it's also worth mentioning that some characters are simply irredeemable. To take a completely random example, a redemption arc for Hannibal Lecter would be nothing short of laughable. It's a good thing they never tried. But given that there's been a large portion of God of War games, especially as far as the more recent entries that focus on giving him a redemptive arc, the question remains. Does he deserve redemption, or is his attempt at redemption on the Hannibal Lecter spectrum? Now, it's important to specify what he's being redeemed for because he lived a long life and did a lot of horrible things. Now, obviously, we're not going to go into every individual sin he committed. If you want that, you can watch my video about if Kratos was charged for his crimes. Believe it or not, he actually gets a longer jail sentence in the Norse games, but that's only because the dude steals a lot. So let's categorize his major sins into broad categories. First of all, you have everything he did pre-Ares. This is largely in regards to his time as a Spartan general. Notably, he was brutal even by Spartan standards. As you will know, the only person who could brave his fury was his wife. So he theoretically would have a lot to answer for in that respect. Second of all would be everything he did post-Ares. Conquesting in his name, killing indiscriminately, killing his own family. There's very little we were privy to, but based on everything we know, he caused a lot of suffering once he pledged his soul to Ares. Now, he didn't do anything particularly callous in the prequel games, Ascension, Chains of Olympus, nor did he do anything particularly callous in God of War 1. He did kill some civilians for health, which is apparently canon, but he didn't do anything so egregious that it can't be categorized alongside the other things he did in this era. Really, his next major sequence of sins would be in God of War 2. He did everything that Ares did, and perhaps even worse, causing suffering and strife among the residents of Greece, all in favor of boosting his own homeland of Sparta. He was so callous as the god of war, it's said that he immediately alienated himself from the rest of the gods, with some even being afraid of him. Following this, he declared all-out war against the gods of Olympus with the help of the Titans. He killed a bunch of gods and brutally and relentlessly killed Zeus in the end, in the process killing countless people in various ways, both directly and indirectly, and caused the total systematic collapse of the entire land. Yeah, things sure did escalate. This is a story well trodden by me and many people, so with that said, given all these infractions, did he deserve redemption and was he capable of redemption, or did his attempts ultimately ring hollow? And ultimately, what does it mean to be redeemed? Because it's not something you can necessarily measure. Now, of course, he was forgiven by the gods for everything he did pre-God of War 1 at the end of the game, but he was forgiven by the gods themselves. And it's hard to really pinpoint their own mentality in this circumstance, and if their opinions really matter, because the perspective of a god, especially gods as notoriously arrogant and egotistical as the Greek gods, will naturally be different to a mortal citizen of ancient Greece, and especially the modern day. The gods may be willing to forgive you for slaughtering a bunch of innocent people because to them, the average human is the equivalent of an ant. So it would take you killing a lot of mortals to genuinely get on their nerves. Meanwhile, they may curse you into oblivion for scuffing their shoe because how dare you scuff a godly shoe. So their forgiveness really isn't conducive as to whether or not it means anything to standard morality and standards of forgiveness. And the same would apply for when Kratos is going too far as the god of war. While he riles up the Greek council and even scares a few of them, enough to alienate himself, who's to say it's necessarily because the Greek gods feel any affection for the humans? To them, this could simply be seen as inconvenient, as if you're smashing their ant farm. So their opinions are ultimately meaningless. So with that said, how do you gauge redemption? How do you gauge forgiveness? Well, without any hardline basis for what it means to be redeemed, all we have are subjective interpretations of morality. And each of these sins are taken on a case-by-case basis because they vary wildly as far as context. Plus, we also have to keep in mind that in a world that's larger than life as this world is, it's difficult to judge the gravity of certain things. In a world of immortal beings and monsters where life is cheap and death is inevitable, 1,000 murders could be seen as carrying the same weight as one murder in our own society. You can't necessarily judge them based on your own moral compass because our own moral compass is born out of what is sadly the most civilized culture in all of human history. So it's easier to justify violence and destruction in a world as uncivilized as the world in which God of War takes place. For example, while Kratos himself as a general may have been notoriously brutal even by the standards of Spartan culture, I don't think you can really pin that on him necessarily. There's obviously the argument of nature versus nurture. If Kratos was brought up in a more civilized society, would he still have been brutal? Who's to say? But the point is, playing with the cards we're dealt is all we can do, and looking at the cards that were dealt to Kratos paints a picture of a man who had no choice but to do what he did. He may have been brutal, but that was Spartan culture. He was brought up in a particularly violent culture to the point where in his older years he holds no reverence for the type of violence and callousness that was expected of him. Ultimately, he can't be blamed for his actions as part of the Spartan army, and that's all for one simple reason. What more could he have done? What else could he have been? The culture demanded strong men and conscripted all men into the army, so he went with it because he didn't know any other way of life. So he has nothing to atone for in that respect, because at this point in his life, the worst thing you can say about him is that he was effective at his job. Any question of morality and atonement that comes up entirely rests on his actions in his later life, particularly once he pledges his soul to Ares. Retroactively speaking, it's said that the pledge to Ares he made corrupted him in such a way that it put him into an altered state, an angry haze where he was less cognizant of the suffering of others. He had less of a conscience, and as such was able to carry out the most brutal whims of Ares without a second thought. That is of course a retcon from God of War Ascension, and it's worth mentioning that it's hard to fully swallow because it's just a blatant retcon to make Kratos seem more sympathetic. But it is canon. Canon to what degree though? Who's to say? I don't know if this was Ares basically taking full control over Kratos, or if it was simply enhancing the negative feelings that already existed within him. The specifics are somewhat vague, possibly by choice. I'm gonna make an educated assumption and say that given that this game felt like it was largely made to rehabilitate Kratos as a character, that the specifics would probably be such to make Kratos seem more sympathetic. But because they don't specify, it is up to interpretation. But still, it is worth mentioning that he was still simply doing his job, but in this case he was doing his job for a different master. And while he didn't know what he was getting himself into at this point, he had all the right intentions. Had he not sold his soul to defeat his enemies, everything he knew would have come to an end. Sparta would have been overrun and destroyed. This is also canon. It's another retcon, but it's a retcon that fits more neatly into canon. He didn't fail as a warrior, he didn't fail as a general, and he didn't fail as a servant. However, he did fail as a father. He failed because whether by choice or not, he killed his family. But while the act of violence that he was committing in that moment was potentially his own choice, he did not intend to commit it against his own family, which in all honesty, one could argue that might actually make it worse, because he's still willingly causing suffering and only stops when it affects someone he cares about. All these other people he killed are someone's child and could have potentially been a mother or father to now orphaned children, so why does one matter more than the others? The fact that he was ostensibly under the influence of Ares is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this instance. It's actually very reminiscent of the story of Heracles, where he actually killed his own wife and child, but only because he was given a brief bout of insanity at the hands of Hera, who had it out for him from the moment he was born. Incidentally, the 12 labors of Heracles, that was as a result of him killing his family, so what does that remind you of? But either way, as the stories line up, neither were in the right state of mind, so one could argue that despite what the gods may have made them do, neither really deserved to be punished. But here's what I think. If I had to put a pin in this particular plot point, he failed as a person, and the degree to which he did so is hard to know because of the aforementioned vagueness of his disposition. But he also failed as a father in regards to his previous family, because there's no greater failure as a man and as a father than killing your own family, and being able to properly raise Atreus against all odds and make him into a mature, well-rounded young man who's able to stand on his own 2 feet means that in my eyes, he was redeemed as a father, and that's a piece of redemption that he was absolutely deserving of, because he did truly love his family. Killing them was his greatest mistake. He deserved to feel the apprehension of his new family on account of what he had previously done, but with that said, I can say with certainty that he did deserve a second chance and was fully redeemed. But he was not redeemed as a person because failing as a father and failing as a person are two entirely separate things. And it's tough for me to say if he can be truly redeemed or if he needed to be redeemed for all the people he killed in this sequence. Regardless of if we're talking about his own family or the families that he tore apart in the moments immediately preceding this, it all comes down to how generously you want to describe him as under the influence of someone else. Either way, I think he does carry some fault. It's hard to say if he collectively carries enough fault that he can never be redeemed. That's not for me to necessarily decide. If I had more info maybe, but alas. Moving on. Next we have the sins he committed as the god of war. Before God of War 2, he does go against the wishes of the entire Greek council of gods in order to ransack the land of the dead and find his brother. Nothing about this is Kratos' fault in my opinion. Sure, Atlantis got destroyed, but that was largely due to Scylla attacking Kratos. Their battle caused a great level of destruction. Had the gods simply backed off and let Kratos do what he wanted to do, Atlantis wouldn't have been destroyed, Thanatos wouldn't have been killed, and their own fears about a gradual increase to the amount of strife within the Greek council wouldn't have come to pass. And regardless of how much blame Kratos could potentially take, there's no doubt that Kratos isn't at fault, simply for the fact that it was all in aid of saving Deimos. And the only reason he needed to save Deimos was because the gods kidnapped him. They made a rod for their own backs. With that said, favoring his own people, causing a buttload of suffering among innocent people, getting personally involved in mortal warfare, and overall being a more brutal version of Ares, that could potentially be something he would have to answer for, but this is also a gray area because once again, how can we really blame Kratos for abusing his power when he didn't want the power to begin with? This all comes back to that single miscalculation that the gods made. They gave Kratos ultimate power. They gave him godhood and he didn't want it. He simply wanted the sweet peace of death after they refused to relieve him of his memories. And what happens when you take someone who is already emotionally volatile, refuse him what he wants twice, and then force him to accept something he doesn't want? Well, you're gonna get somebody who's very moody and who's gonna act out. It's like, what, you guys want me to be the new god of war? Fine, I'll be the new god of war, and I'm going to do what I want to do in this position, and if you don't like it, you can suck it. That's something that I think that we can all get behind, and it's because of that factor that I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the blood spilled is on the hands of the likes of Zeus, Athena, Poseidon, etc. Sure, Kratos is acting under his own willpower, but he's also not really acting as he would if he had taken the job willingly because he was forced to do the job. It was only through godly arrogance that the Greek pantheon misjudged Kratos' capacity to be justifiably petty. And yes, there's also the point to be made about perhaps the gods themselves weren't acting under their own power because they were being corrupted by Pandora's box. But if that's the case, then neither party was acting in their right mind. Kratos was responding to the energy that was being given to him, but the energy that was being given to him wasn't the energy that the gods normally would have given him. So it's a battle between two corrupted forces that ultimately led to a lot of innocent people dying, and if you ask me, the same could be said about the subsequent invasion of Mount Olympus by the Titans. The Titans wanted revenge, the gods, while corrupted, were protecting themselves, and Kratos was simply responding to the energy that he had been given for the past however many years of his life. And by this point, even if they weren't necessarily acting under their own power, the gods still deserved what was coming to them. They had completely screwed Kratos time and again. They made his life hell, and even before they were officially corrupted, they were still horrible. Even Mimir gave no bones about the fact that the Greek gods had what was coming to them.
Oh, don't mistake me, brother. From what I heard, the Pantheon had it coming. It's still a bit to take in.
But with that said, there is one factor here that does get in the way of Kratos being able to justify his actions. Yes, he was fully justified in killing the gods, and as such no redemption required. However, the suffering of the people of Greece was obvious from the moment Poseidon died. The entire region was wiped off the map piece by piece, and every time you had a contingent of people who survived, their suffering gradually got worse and worse the more gods were bumped off. Any person with any level of morality could see that and would realize that what they were doing was destructive and horrible. And that's where justification ends. It's a weird variation of the trolley problem. If one person truly deserves to die but his death indirectly causes the death of a million other people, are you really able to morally justify killing that one person? Personally, I don't think so. If Kratos had any humanity left, he would have killed Poseidon, he would have seen the flooding, and he would have immediately stopped. where at the very least he would have stopped trying to deliberately kill the gods. They would probably still come after him, and in that case whatever blood would be on his hands would be completely in self-defense. But any good person would have stopped the suffering, and he chose to keep going. He chose to kill god after god, even those he could have potentially left alive. To paraphrase Kratos himself, he killed many people who deserved it, and many, many more, whether directly or indirectly, who didn't. Sure, in the end he gave the power of hope back to the people, but what did it matter? There was nobody left. That's his equivalent of tossing the Emperor down the chute at the end of Return of the Jedi. Sure, he did a good thing, and sure, he put an end to all the madness, but that still doesn't undo the unjustifiably horrible things he's done. And that, in my opinion, is where we have to draw the line as far as whether or not he deserves redemption, whether he could have been redeemed or not. Because you can't cause the destruction of this many people in one fell swoop and ever do enough good to be able to atone. Even if we were using a measurement like the theoretical 1,000-to-1 measurement, that still leaves Kratos with too much blood on his hands to ever wash off. By all rights, he can and should be living in the shadow of who he was for the rest of time, in the same way that somebody with a lifetime sentence would and should constantly live in the shadow of what they did. Given the fact that they did make him so closed off and so apprehensive to even discuss the barest of bare-bones details about his past in the more modern games, should tell you that this is what they were going for. He can't undo what he did. He knows he can't undo what he did, and that's clear from the moment the madness is over. He doesn't believe that he deserves redemption, and quite frankly, he lives in fear of ever becoming that person ever again. With that said, there is something to be said about personal forgiveness, though. While I believe that he can never truly be redeemed for some of his actions, I don't think the games really insist that he should be. Largely, his character arc in the Norse games revolve around him opening up, forgiving himself, allowing himself peace despite everything he's done. And much like how being redeemed as a person and being redeemed as a father are two separate things, being forgiven and being able to forgive yourself are also two completely separate things. And by the end of the Norse games, he's able to come to terms with his past and is able to let go in order to create what he hopes will end up being a better future. And that's one of my favorite parts of Valhalla, is Kratos facing his younger self, and even at one point he says that there is no forgiving him.
You lost everything. And everyone. You became... There is no forgiving you. You chose! I chose.
But the fact is, God of War Valhalla was a very personal journey with Kratos. Something that was born not of the desire to atone for his sins, to undo the damage that he had previously done. It was all about Kratos finding it in himself to forgive himself, not for anybody else to do so. To, at the very least, become a better person tomorrow, because what he did yesterday, well, he can never undo that. And that, I believe, is valid, because even if you did something for which you can never be forgiven, the only way to truly begin the process of being better is to not let yourself be caught in the shadow of your past. Who we are today is not beholden to who we were yesterday, in theory. And everyone should at least attempt to be the best version of who they are today, even if they weren't that person yesterday. And if it requires you to try and move past some great misdeed within reason, one's own ability to forgive themselves should be the first step in being that better person. It also helps that this is fictional, and as such we don't have to really weigh his sins in a real life context. If you believe Kratos forgiving himself is a form of redemption, then he deserves redemption. But as far as someone on the outside looking in, well, there are some things for which he deserves redemption, and as a matter of fact, I believe that he has been redeemed for such actions. There are some things he holds little to no fault over due to extenuating circumstances, and of course there are certain things that he can never and should never be forgiven for. That's my opinion, and it really is the most subjective of subjective topics because there's no such thing as objective morality. People's beliefs will vary, so the only thing you can do is based on your own personal opinions and based on whatever context is available, you can gauge your own opinion. There's a reason why in court you must have the unanimous opinion of 12 separate people because no one person has authority on what's right and wrong. Maybe you believe that Kratos is more at fault for what he did during the Spartan army portion or under the auspices of Ares. Maybe you don't think he was justified in his actions as the god of war because he should have known better than to be like the person who tortured him. I don't know, it's all just my 2 cents. So let me know in the comments section what you think. What was Kratos at fault for? What wasn't he at fault for? And does he deserve redemption for his actions? And what actions did he commit which were too far to ever be forgiven for? Let me know in the comment section, and if you like this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I know for a fact most of you watching aren't already subscribed, so get on that. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.